Good evening. Thanks, choir. Thank you all, Festival of Faiths, all the organizers, Christy Brown, for this invitation. Interesting timing. So, we've just met, but one of the fundamental truths I believe about humanity is one of the basic things that we owe each other is honesty. If I can't give you anything else, I can give you honesty. And so I stand before you tonight with my tank nearly empty. I stand before you tonight weary. Of course, I'm talking about the 2024 presidential election and the results. Between August 1st and last week, I did not have more than 3 days in a row at home here in Louisville. I was crisscrossing the country speaking to groups like this, trying to sound the alarm about authoritarianism and white Christian nationalism and impressing upon us the need to mobilize. And all of that to get the results. So I stand here before you honestly saying, I'm tired. But that doesn't quite capture it. I want to read to you the words of a black scholar, writer, and full-time black woman, Brittany Cooper. She wrote this on social media a couple of days ago, and I think it captures the level of fatigue that I'm feeling. She said, "The exhaustion has settled in. The hypervigilance that is black people's perpetual condition is exacerbating the world weariness I already felt. What I feel is tired. While I am very glad that there are organizers who are apocalypse ready, I do not feel ready. We are on the brink of subjecting black folks to the brutality that our ancestors prayed and fought for us never to have to experience again. I am tired. Tired of black women being both hypervisible and invisible, and yet after such intense scrutiny, always being found wanting, insufficient, never truly seen. I came here to say that we deserved a victory lap, not a marathon tacked onto us at the 26-mile mark. Let me read that again. We deserved a victory lap, not a marathon tacked onto us at the 26-mile mark. My tired is tired. I'm saying I'm tired and scared. I am terrified of the onslaught to come that is here. Can we say that? Perhaps admitting fear feels like betrayal. But there is no amount of hypervigilance, preparation, or catastrophizing that will fix this. We just have to show up. And I'm tired. Now, if you had heard me give a talk like this 2 weeks ago, I would have told you from the very beginning that my goal was to encourage you. That I would want you to walk out feeling strengthened, enthusiastic, and even hopeful. Well, that may happen tonight. But I stand before you honestly saying that although the message is consistent, the goal this evening has shifted slightly. You see, because I think we should bring back that spiritual practice of lament. The idea of mourning with those who mourn. I think in this nation in particular, we're quick to rush past those emotions. We're quick to say, oh, we suffered a defeat. Let's get back up. Let's be active. Let's fix this. I, for one, am not at that place in this moment. And you may not be at that place in this moment. And if you are in that place, but you feel guilty about being in that place, I'm here to tell you, be in that place. Take all the time you need. There is space in our faiths for grief, for mourning, for lament. And I would encourage us, if you haven't already, or if you're still in the midst of it, just to sit with the gravity of this moment and not rush past it. So no, I don't come before you and say, I hope you leave encouraged. Here's what I hope. I hope to give you information that plants a seed. Plants a seed in the soil of your hearts that when it's ready, will grow and bear fruit. That seed in your heart may be ready a day from now, a week from now, a month from now, a year from now. Take however much time you need. Because no matter who wins an election, we should not lose our health. So tonight, just want to plant a seed. And when that seed grows and bears fruit in you, it may well result in encouragement. But if that's not where you are right now, that's okay. Just take this information. Put it in your back pocket. And when you're ready, it'll be there. Now, with that preamble, I want to talk about the spirit of justice and reimagining belonging. The spirit of justice and reimagining belonging. So, in my work with justice, I think we need to change our calculus about how we evaluate justice. If our only evaluation of how effective we are in our justice work is what happens out there, then what happens when you lose? How do you keep going? So, I think to that point, we need to actually think about reimagining belonging differently. We need to think about not just what happens out there in the world. We need to reimagine belonging, and it's not just about the changes in the world, but the changes that happen in you. We have to become people of belonging. How can you reimagine belonging if you are not a person of peace, if you are not a person who welcomes others, if you are not a person of kindness? We have to bring back that old-fashioned spiritual world called virtue. Virtue. That who you are matters. What kind of person you are matters. And I dare say that in our work of justice and in our work of reimagining belonging, whether we win or lose, whether the results we want come about or not, who we become in the process is just as important. So I want to talk to you about 4 virtues. And I want you to meet some of my historical friends along the way who demonstrate each virtue. This is coming mostly out of my latest book, The Spirit of Justice, True Stories of Faith, Race, and Resistance. If those words didn't move you, if those words don't capture it for you, the choir did. That's what this book is talking about. And in the final chapter of the book, I talk about 4 virtues that I think tie together the more than 50 different figures I profile in the book. And those virtues are faith, courage, imagination, and resilience. Faith, courage, imagination, and resilience. I got to do a little bit of this first, because I always tell people, this is the beginning of a conversation. If you want to continue it, I write a lot. So, I am super excited about my first picture book. It's called I Am the Spirit of Justice. It's for kids ages 4 to 7. If we want to interrupt generational cycles of injustice and exclusion, we have to begin with children. That is coming out in January. You can order it now. But that's not it. I used to be a 6th grade teacher, and so I got to give love to the middle school ages. So the next book is called Stories of the Spirit of Justice, and this is for young people ages 8 to 12. And that comes out in January as well. Let's train them up. Let's teach them early on about belonging and justice. And then lastly, you are invited to keep up with my latest work and writing at my Substack. That's a newsletter on steroids, basically. So this is the beginning of a conversation. Let's talk about reimagining justice, reimagining belonging through the spirit of justice. So I have to move quickly here because I want you to have time with the panel. Let's begin with faith. Let me ask you something. First of all, folks, you got a lot of black folk here tonight. I need help. So when I speak, this is dialectical, you can talk back, okay? All right? You don't need to sit here like just silent and very pious and absorbing things. I need my help, okay? So we're going to talk about faith, and let me begin by asking you, when did we separate faith from activism? When did we separate faith from activism? Because in my historical studies, I see that throughout the black freedom struggle, it was often people of faith who took the most courageous action for justice, who had the most active imaginations for reimagining belonging. And so one of the criteria of the book, The Spirit of Justice, was, could I connect their activism and their faith? Could I draw the lines, connect the dots in the historical record, and show that what was motivating their activism was their faith? And I want to tell you about, there's one scripture verse that we all reference in the Christian tradition from Ephesians 6 and 12. For our struggle is not against flesh and blood. I'm not too grown to be spiritual, y'all. I don't know about you. For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of this dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. If you don't believe that there are people out there with malicious intent, you haven't been paying attention. This is spiritual stuff. You think it's just about putting a ballot in a box. This is spiritual. And let me tell you about somebody who I look to as a spiritual hero of the faith. Her name is Prathia Hall. Many people haven't heard of her, but I guarantee you will know her by the end of this. She was born in Philadelphia on June 29th, 1940. She grew up as a preacher's kid. Her daddy was a pastor. Not only a pastor, he started the church, and they practically lived at the church. And far from repelling her from the faith, Prathia Hall was a very faithful spiritual person, even as a child. And from an early age, she had a deep passion for activism rooted in her faith. She said, I was raised by my parents in what I believe to be the central dynamic, somebody say central dynamic, in the African American religious tradition. That is an integration of the religious and the political. Because they told me you couldn't talk about politics in church. That's what they told me, but she said the central dynamic is an integration of the religious and the political. It is a belief that God intends us to be free and assists us and empowers us in the struggle for freedom. So the stories of our history help me understand that faith and activism go together. And that's what Prathia Hall talked about. She talked about a freedom faith. The belief that God wants people to be free and equips and empowers those who worked for freedom. So she lived out her faith. Prathia Hall was one of these folks. She was wildly intelligent. She went on and got her PhD. She was a theologian, all of that stuff. But when she was an undergrad in college, the civil rights movement was happening. She almost quit school to go be part of the movement. Now, I don't know about you, but when I'm 18, 19, 20, 21 years old, I'm not thinking about quitting school for the possibility of being beaten and arrested. She lived out her faith. As soon as she graduated, she went down to Georgia. And in Georgia, she went up to the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, offices, and she says, I want to help. And they said, who are you? But okay. And they sent her down to a county called Terrell County, Georgia, nicknamed Terrible Terrell. At the home she was staying in, night riders, the Ku Klux Klan, came by and shot up the house, and she was injured. She said that night, any and all romantic thoughts about our freedom adventure dissolved as we came face to face with the real and present possibility of death. Most of us wouldn't even take the step to go down there. Many of us would have left after an incident like that. She stayed. You want to talk about faith. Now, as she was down there, there was a series of church burnings. You know, black churches have been sites of strength and empowerment and community organizing for black folks for centuries. So when white racial terrorists wanted to strike fear in the hearts of the African-American community, they went after the churches. After a series of arsons where these churches were burned down, they held a vigil in support of these churches and their congregations. They asked Prathia Hall to pray a prayer. In that prayer, she used a phrase over and over again. That phrase was, I have a dream. In the crowd that day was a young preacher named Martin Luther King Jr. He walked up to her after that and said, that was very beautiful. Those words were wonderful. I wonder if I could borrow them and use them in some of my speeches. And she said, sure, and you don't have to give attribution. These are words for everyone. And I think we heard those words show up again. I have a dream. That's Prathia Hall. And she went on and got her PhD, became a professor at Boston University. She was a pioneer of womanist theology, that is biblical interpretation from a black woman's perspective. And she was an incredible preacher, such that Martin Luther King Jr. said, Prathia Hall is one preacher that I don't want to speak after. That repetition of the dream is a reimagining of belonging. I have a dream means I have an imagination, I have a picture, I have a vision of belonging that is not yet present, but what we're moving toward. Faith. Let me speak to you briefly about courage. In the introduction, they mentioned courage. And if I ever sign my first book for you, The Color of Compromise, I'll often sign it with the words, be strong and courageous. In Joshua chapter 1, God says to Joshua 3 times in the first 9 verses, be strong and courageous, be strong and very courageous, be strong and courageous, and ends in that verse 9, have I not commanded you, be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid, do not be dismayed, for I am with you wherever you go. Courage, I think, is the foundational virtue because it is the virtue that enables the practice of the other virtues. If you don't have courage, you won't step out on faith. If you don't have courage, you can't exercise imagination. If you don't have courage, you won't have resilience. So I think it is foundational. And I want to tell you about one of my favorite historical heroes. Her name is Fannie Lou Hamer. She was born in 1917. She was the 20th of 20 children. Now, can you imagine? Talk about never getting new clothes. It's hand-me-downs for your entire life. And they were poor. They were born in Sunflower County, Mississippi, which is in the Delta. If you don't know anything about the Delta, it's cotton country. I lived in the Delta for 15 years. After college, I joined Teach for America. I was placed in the Mississippi Delta on the Arkansas side. So I have an affinity for women like Fannie Lou Hamer because I understand that context. Now, she had 3 strikes against her, humanly speaking. She was poor, she was black, and she was a woman. She grew up and married a sharecropper. She would have lived and died in obscurity had it not been for one fateful day in 1962 at her church, where she heard a presentation about voting rights. And when they asked for volunteers to go and register to vote, she said, I raised my hand as high as it could go. Now, what happened was this. They went with a small group of people to the county courthouse to try to register to vote. Not only were they turned away by men with guns. Upon returning to the plantation, the Marlowe plantation, this white man had heard about her being part of this group of agitators, and he said, you better stop this. And she said, Mr. Marlowe, I didn't go down there to register for you. I went down there to register for me. And that very day, she was not only fired from her job, she was kicked off the plantation. Now, can you imagine going to try to register to vote, and the consequences of it are you are threatened with guns, you lose your job, and you lose your house to register. This is why I tell my students we have no excuse. Because now you can do it with a few taps on a screen or a phone, you can register. And she lost her job and her house and had her life threatened. But I talked to you about courage, and she is, to me, the example of courage. She said this, I guess if I'd had any sense, I'd have been a little scared. But what was the point of being scared? The only thing they could do to me was kill me. And it seemed like they've been trying to do that a little bit at a time ever since I could remember. Not only did Fannie Lou Hamer continue in the struggle, she never left the Delta. I like to say that when it comes to things like racial justice, we don't have a how-to problem, we have a want-to problem. What do I mean? We don't have a how-to problem because if I gave you all 2 minutes to jot down some thoughts about what we can do about something like racism, you all could come up with some good ideas. The methods haven't changed. The principles haven't changed in a long time. The only question is not how to, but will you? And that's a matter of courage. Let me talk to you now about imagination. Martin Luther King Jr. popularized the phrase beloved community. What is beloved community but a reimagining of belonging? Oftentimes, people in the activist community, we embrace our call to be a prophetic voice, which we often interpret as denouncing the status quo, pointing out what's wrong. What we talk less about is what to build in its place. This is a question of imagination. So you can't just deconstruct. You also have to construct. You can't just tear down. You also have to give a vision of what it looks like to build up. So one of the things that makes imagination so difficult is, did you know this? Oppression suppresses imagination. Oppression suppresses imagination. What do I mean? I told you I lived in the Delta. It is a place that is majority black and yet has a very low voter turnout. And yet they're the first, because of their vulnerability, to feel some of the worst effects of bad policy. And so I'm scratching my head like, you all know better than most people what a bad policy can do in your community. Why aren't you more active? I came to discover they weren't more active and news junkies and politically active because they were concerned about survival. I had the parent of a student who they had several siblings at the school, and the siblings would often miss school, and I wondered why that was, and we would do home visits, and we would go to the home and inquire and do check-ins, and went to the home and came to discover that the kids were missing school because the mom had to choose between paying the light bill and fixing her car. She chose to keep the lights on at home, so the car remained broken, and she would often have to hitch a ride with someone or try to catch the bus, and they'd be late, and that's why the kids were missing school. If that's your daily reality, where is the room for imagination? Oppression suppresses imagination, but I want to tell you what imagination can do in the realm of justice. You maybe have heard of, but maybe not, Charles Hamilton Houston. He was a brilliant man. He grew up in Washington, D.C. in the early 20th century. His father was a medical doctor. His mother was a homemaker. He graduated Amherst College in Massachusetts. He was one of the top students. Then after college, he joined the Army. And he experienced acute racism that changed the trajectory of his life. He joined as a lieutenant but faced discrimination, segregation, all of those things. And he came out saying this: "I made up my mind that I would never get caught again without knowing something about my rights. And I would study law and use my time fighting for people who couldn't strike back." And that's what he did. He went to Harvard Law School, where he became the first black person to serve on the editorial board of the Harvard Law Review. Then he taught at Howard Law School, a historically black college, and transformed it from a part-time, unaccredited night program into an accredited program and the destination for black lawyers. At one point, Howard Law trained up to 25% of all black lawyers in the whole country. Then the NAACP tapped him and said, "Will you come head up our legal team? We're trying to do something about this segregation thing." And here's where the imagination comes in. Charles Hamilton Houston was a smart guy, and he was creative. So they wanted to challenge legalized segregation in the form of Jim Crow, which dates back to the 1896 Plessy v. Ferguson decision that enshrined the doctrine of separate but equal. So Hamilton Houston says, that's interesting. Most lawyers are going to challenge the separate part. We should be together. Houston didn't do that. He said, we're going to challenge the equal part. So, okay, you want us to be separate, but you said all of our separate facilities have to be equal to what white people get. And let me clue you in on a historical secret. That was never the case. And so he argued a case in Missouri on behalf of some black folks who wanted to go to a graduate school. They didn't have a graduate school in that particular discipline for black people in the entire state. And so he argued on the basis of, you want us to be separate, but you don't even have this program in the whole state for black people. And he won that case. And he discipled a bunch of lawyers who came after him. Now, Charles Hamilton Houston died before this happened, but one of the young lawyers he trained was a man named Thurgood Marshall. Thurgood Marshall went before the Supreme Court in 1954 and argued against legalized segregation. And did you know that the majority opinion, there was a quote in it from the Supreme Court, the Chief Justice at that time, that said, "Separate is inherently unequal." And did you ever imagine that imagination would play such a big role in the law? Lawyers are some creative folk. Use your powers for good. Now, I want to end with a word on resilience. And I want to tell you the story that inspired the spirit of justice. It was December 9th, 2017. It was the grand opening of the Civil Rights Museum in Jackson, Mississippi. Myrlie Evers Williams, her name may sound familiar to you because her husband Medgar Evers was assassinated in front of their home in June of 1963. She held his bleeding body in her arms as he died. It didn't strike me till many years later. Myrlie Evers Williams went on a private tour of the Civil Rights Museum on opening day, and it didn't strike me till years later that in that museum, they have the very rifle used to kill her husband. Can you imagine standing mere steps away from that instrument of death? Then afterwards, she gives this nationally televised speech full of hope and encouragement. But after, I got to be a witness to something. She held a press conference, and a journalist asked her, Myrlie Evers Williams, how does the justice landscape today in the 21st century compare to the 1950s and 60s in the civil rights movement? And thankfully, I had my little cell phone out, and I recorded it. So I'd like you to hear from Myrlie Evers Williams herself in response to that.
This great event is being covered by the media to the extent that it is. I don't mind admitting this to the press. I'm a little weary at this point. But something about the spirit of justice that raises up like a war horse. That horse that stands with its back sunk in. And he hears that bell. And I like to say the bell of freedom. And all of a sudden, it becomes straight and the back becomes stiff. And you become determined all over again.
But it's something about the spirit of justice. Why do I bring up Myrlie Evers in the context of resilience? Because you realize that after that assassination, she picked up and moved her family from Mississippi to California as the widow and mother of 3 children. When she married Medgar Evers, she had to quit college so she could become a full-time homemaker. She went back to college as a grown woman and finished her degree. She held a series of prestigious appointments in California and in city government. And in the 1990s, the NAACP called her back, the very organization for which her husband had died working for, called her back to be chairman of their board. She brought them out of debt, restored a national reputation, but most of all, in terms of resilience, they knew who her husband's killer was. And for 31 years, she saw trial after trial end with his acquittal, end with him not serving any time, until finally, in the 90s, the court came back. We find the defendant guilty as charged. Myrlie Evers Williams persisted for 3 decades until her husband's killer was held accountable. That is resilience. And when I look at this cloud of historical heroes, and I wonder what manner of people is this, I go back to Myrlie Evers Williams' words, and it's something about the spirit of justice. There is something about the spirit of justice, that inner force that moves us to demand dignity and respect for ourselves and others. It's the cry of our souls for the world to be fair and a kind place. It's the power that inspires people to speak up when others remain silent, to move when others stand still, to put themselves on the line when others choose to remain comfortable. The spirit of justice does not just belong to the past. The spirit of justice belongs to all of us. And in these times, we have to remember those words. There's something about the spirit of justice. When they tell you you're moving too fast in your calls for justice, there's something about the spirit of justice. When you know that change is happening actually too slowly, there's something about the spirit of justice. When they tell you, you sound angry, well, there's something about the spirit of justice. When they squash your ideas because they can't see the vision, there's something about the spirit of justice. When your friend or your family members believes misinformation, there's something about the spirit of justice. When white Christian nationalism paints your faith in ugly color, there's something about the spirit of justice. When they threaten to pull your funding, there's something about the spirit of justice. When they threaten to deport your neighbor, there's something about the spirit of justice. When you see the next news headline announcing another dehumanizing policy, there's something about the spirit of justice. There is something about the spirit of justice, and it makes you determined all over again. We need faith. We need courage, we need imagination, and we need resilience to reimagine belonging, but we also need the spirit of justice. Thank you. Thank you.